Yeah, thank you, DSM, for inviting me for the session as well. It's a pleasure coming on board here and also for being part of the core panel for this tournament as well. I'm glad to see a lot of people have joined in for today. So, we're going to be discussing basic economic concepts for debating and public speaking. So, there are a couple of caveats before we move on. But before I move on to those caveats, let me just give you a brief overview of myself. As DSM has already mentioned so glowingly about what I do, I'm basically a judge and a speaker, and I've been debating for around 8 to 10 years now across India and across tournaments abroad as well. And it's been a pleasure debating and teaching people. Currently, I am somebody who coaches in debating and also takes part in different competitions around the world, but is also trying to contribute, as DSM has mentioned previously, on platforms like YouTube from our channel, The Debate Central and Odesha Podium, talking about debater stories and journeys and conducting workshops. So I'm pretty hopeful that within my limited sphere of experience, you'll have like a nice session about learning economic concepts and why we are discussing economics in general. So there are a couple of reasons why we discuss economics, but before that, let's give you a couple of caveats. So this workshop is catered towards people from, say, a non-economic background, and it's somewhat going to be discussing economic concepts that are more or less going to be helpful for you in any sphere of debating. Firstly, from a beginner's perspective and somebody who's not approached economics as thoroughly as they would have probably before, or in terms of like rigorous coursework. So this is going to give you like a basic understanding about what all economic concepts are important for debating, but also in terms of what kind of like necessary argumentation structures and other things that you can run in terms of economic concepts. What we'll do for that is we'll discuss like basic principles of what different factors of economics are, but then also give you examples and tangible like inputs about how to use them in situations and debates. So yeah, with that, why are we discussing economics in general, right? I think economics has two paradigms that we need to be considering in terms of discussions for this workshop. One paradigm is the fact that, of course, motions directly do come from economic concepts, which means that there are themes set around economics. But I think, secondly, something which is much more overlooked is that economics is a very important principle about how communal spaces operate, but also in terms of how impacts and benefits of different individuals are passed on along the way in terms of maybe social good or social harm, which are key things which are important to like talk about in terms of different spheres of themes as well, apart from economics. So even if you're talking about things like religion, social economics, or social policy, or in terms of like law, or in terms of application of different political tools or methods, in terms of different debate motions and concepts, all of these things still have like an underpinning of economics, which is why it is important to understand what are the principles which are driving economic concepts towards debating better, but also in terms of how you can debate better by providing better economic terms and understanding economics better. So, economics, of course, is an essential tool for proving impacts in a debate space as well. Many debaters often have relied purely on moral claims, like sometimes people argue on the ground of principles without explaining the consequences of what those practical limitations or practical applications of a policy or, say, a conversation in terms of happening which happens within the same motion or fabric of the motion or burdens that you're trying to justify in terms of those claims, what essentially are like the tangible outcomes. So economics helps to deliver those like tangible outcomes through your principal benefits. An example could simply mean, say for instance, you are talking about how social welfare schemes can be better for doing communal good, but you don't really highlight what kind of like incentives or benefits in terms of economics, in terms of like application, or in terms of delivering better public spaces would be. I think that becomes the entire issue where you are trying to like unearth a lot of like conversation points and discussions around that factor. So I think there is a lot of like critical aspects that you need to look at in terms of debating from, say, an economic perspectives. So the simple application, because we are doing public speaking and debating for this tournament, I think for debate you usually have economic terms which gives you the analytical link between what is going to be required for proving your impacts, but also like building them to a degree in which those impacts are actually true or actually like defendable in terms of the paradigm that you're debating from. In public speaking also, or in general speaking terms beyond debating, using economic language sometimes will build your credibility, but also like looks at how you are authoritative and better in terms of delivering content and delivering different angles or approaches related to economic concepts. So there are like a lot of critical things which people often miss out upon when discussing economic policy and economic strategy is that economics also has like a humane nature to it, and how these things in terms of a social cause would derive some benefits for different individuals. To simplify this idea, for instance, if I am somebody who is like from a middle income family from any country, and there is somebody else from, say, a low income family from the same country, the social realities of these individuals are also like very considerably different. And I think that is something which is not that fluently expressed by beginner debaters in general, but also in terms of some like people who are not acclimatized towards economic policy or economic discussions, very easily accessible to them as terms of proving impacts of social good or social benefits when you're going to go ahead and like defend your burdens for that motion. So transitionally, a lot of important impetus is left out from what economics could give you, and what also economics is supposed to be like in terms of policy mechanisms, or in terms of, say, how people consider economics to be beneficial or harmful in terms of the application of social policy and social welfare schemes. So this is something that I can also like elaborate a bit more from some other perspectives and examples as well. In my country that I come from, India, there is some amount of socialism which is there. Like there is some amount of social upliftment schemes. There's some amount of like social welfare programs that are running. We can't really look at those social welfare programs without looking at what kind of like economic operations are occurring to make those social welfare programs actually beneficial. So if there was a debate which happened around, say, a motion of this house would implement social welfare schemes for people below the poverty line in India, I think that becomes a very tangible like aspect that you need to think about in terms of who are these individuals below the poverty line, what kind of social exodus or social problems do these individuals face, and how do these economic principles and economic actions go ahead and make changes which are relevant towards that particular sphere of society. So it is hard to sometimes like relay a lot of information which is equally or equivocally important in terms of social issues, but also that in terms of analyzing those social issues from the economic perspective, there's always like problems sometimes in deciphering, say, what is the exact ideological shift that you need to make this supposed social policy work, but also in terms of, say, economic narratives, how we are going to go ahead and like make those social narratives more justifiable in terms of tangible benefits that can like introspectively become better, or say help the community grow in a sense. So I think there are a couple of ways in which we can like ease this idea about how to talk about economics on a perspective of social scales, but also on the perspective of how economics operate in the general term for the world, right? So we will be discussing a couple of concepts, primarily very like simple economic principles, and what those principles essentially derive towards like talking about different motion spaces and different like qualitative aspects of those particular principles as well. The first one that we'll be talking about is the supply and demand. So supply and demand is a very like primal economic concept. What it denotes is very simple, that in terms of a market space, whenever you're talking about the price and quantity of goods in a market, it is often determined by their availability and how many people actually need it. So there are three like laws of supply and demand. One is the law of supply, law of demand, and the third one is the equilibrium. You can consider these things as important in terms of the debating aspects of economics as well, because I think whenever you're debating, say, targeted economic motions, you always have to consider what kind of like restrictions are there for the application of tangible impacts from that particular idea. Or if you're talking about, say, economics related to certain things like food policy, or you're talking about economics related to certain things like welfare, or say talking about simply that how do you transmute certain goods from one locality in your country to another, in terms of how those things might cost like expenses, how might they be labor intensive, or those processes and so on. All of these issues, when you're debating economics motions, are somewhat correlative towards what kind of supply and demand exists. In case there is no supply, there would be an excessive demand if there is a need for that product. In case of low demand but excessive supply, the cost of that product goes down. So this denotes a lot of like other economic principles as well, in terms of how markets operate, in terms of how inflation operates, in terms of how the gross domestic product of a country operates. And these are concepts that we will be discussing a bit ahead in the workshop as well, in terms of how they are and what they do. But you would be then questioning that if you're talking about like core economic principles like supply and demand, how does it become relevant or translated into like debate terms? So let's just first look at what these three things are, and I'll tell you why that is something which is applicable in terms of motion analysis and context in terms of preparation. So, by the law of supply, when something becomes cheaper, more people would obviously want to buy it. When it becomes more expensive, people buy it less. So, if suppose you are going ahead and buying a chocolate, if the chocolate tomorrow costs less amount of money, you will of course be able to buy more of the chocolate. So, there would be a lot more people who are going to go ahead and buy it. Now, that means that there is an increase in demand of it if the commodity is becoming cheaper to supply. The second aspect of this is that if you're, say, for example, increasing the price of the chocolate, it means that more people are less likely to buy it because the cost of that good or commodity becomes more. So, in terms of the corollary or the antecedent towards this idea, is the law of demand. So, when if a price of a product goes up, sellers are willing to produce those particular things more and sell them more just to record more amount of profit on their balance books. So, simply also when the price of a commodity goes down, they are also less incentivized to produce and sell those products as well. And equilibrium correlates this law of supply and law of demand and correlates the idea that what is the point at which perfectly this supply and this demand would meet up. So, equilibrium is essentially the state of a perfect match where buyers and sellers agree on the price and there's no shortage or surplus, which is rarely like this is also something which we refer to as market equilibrium. But this is rarely something that comes into picture here because it's not something that is easily achievable. So let's go deep into this, right? So if you're talking about prices rising and producers are willing to supply more of the product, and as prices fall, producers are willing to supply less of it. An example to just demonstrate this is if a bakery is selling a cupcake for $2 and produces 100 cupcakes a day, the price of this particular cupcake, if it rises to $4 per cupcake, the bakery would start making 200 cupcakes daily to take advantage of the higher price. So there are two aspects here. One is that the incentive of a producer is to produce goods which gives them more amount of profit, but the interest of the consumer is to purchase goods which are cheaper, but there are other benefits which are associated with the purchase of the goods. Now, there are certain things which you need to be careful about. This does not directly reflect the social understanding of acceptable goods or services. Maybe there are certain products which are not acceptable or maybe shunned in society. Examples could be cigarettes or tobacco and so on. There are also like a lot of other like correlative factors which you need to be careful about when you're addressing these aspects, right? That prices can't always be considerably hiked because there might be sometimes considerable subsidy which is applied from the government, or there might be price capping mechanisms that governments operate within. So all of these things become like equivalent in terms of understanding that these apply throughout, say, the market, and you have to be considering other market factors which we also talk about in terms of the examples I give you, like what is the issues when there are certain price caps which are introduced, what are the issues when there are certain things which are not going to go ahead and like sell better when there is less amount of like considerable requirement for it. And whoever is unmuted, please do mute yourself. So in the same idea, if you're taking the example of the law of demand, if you're buying a new smartphone and it is released for $1,500, fewer people will buy it if because they would then need to have an income matching that amount to actually go ahead and purchase it, or the surplus amount of money which is there. But if the same level of product is sold at a cheaper rate, the same exact product where the attributes of the product are completely the same. Suppose you are purchasing your smartphone. If the smartphone was initially priced at say X amount of money and now it becomes 80% of X amount of money, which is that it's 20% discounted from its original cost, more people would want to purchase it. So there is always this phenomena, right, in market also, that when you're discounting certain products or commodities, more people are likely to go ahead and purchase those products or commodities because there is this incentive for humans to say get the best deal which is possible from that particular bargain or that particular like lowering of the price of that commodity. Now, what we do here in terms of like economic policy is somewhat look at the idea where we can match supply and demand, which is called the market equilibrium. When you're reaching market equilibrium, the consumers are and the market like suppliers or the producers are meeting and reaching at a price point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, which means there is perfect um, fulfillment of say supply and perfect like matching of demand within that. So there is neither a surplus nor a shortage. Now the example here could be, for example, if a store is selling a sneaker at $50 per pair and you are trying to match supply and demand at 100 pairs per week, raising the price to $70 would create a surplus, while dropping it to $30 would cause a shortage. So that 100 pairs per week is the demand. And if you're selling the shoe at $50 per pair, you're selling 100 pairs. The moment you increase the amount of money, you are selling less than 100. If you are increasing or sorry, decreasing the price of money, you're suddenly required to sell, you suddenly have more demand than the 100 pairs you can produce in that particular period of time. So this becomes a very like important consideration. So you have to be careful in understanding how these terms operate. Now you will be asking me what is the relevance in terms of say debating and application for debates, right? I think the first thing that would be very important to consider is how the market operates and what kind of behaviors people would emulate in the market. So there are different types of economic motions, and economic motion can be simply around say certain policies of how the government operates. So suppose if the government is supposed to give welfare schemes towards a lot of people, I'm taking the same example as before, and you only have like x amount of resources that the government possesses, or there is a minimum amount of or limited amount of money that this government has possession of from taxation and other incentives that these or other methods that the government employs to create these particular revenue sources. So if the revenue is an amount and your demand for that social welfare reaches a particular place, the amount of social welfare you can provide to these particular individuals in the community is limited at a capped amount, where the demand for that social welfare scheme is matched by the provision of the government of the funds that it has allocated for that social welfare program. So in any case or any situation when you're discussing different aspects of market supplies and market demands, you would always see that social narratives or like company operations or company behaviors are always matched towards these particular principles. So if tomorrow there's an AI company who is selling like AI products, and this motion is about say AI products should be limited in terms of its proliferation and it should be capped at its like cost. If you're capping it at its cost, you need to understand what that cost indicates and what kind of like profit margins the companies operate within, and then you can see like what kind of demand the market has. So it has some amount of like operative value in terms of how you're discussing different aspects. Now, why is this something that is considerable, and also how do judges consider these aspects? I think this is something which is equally as important to consider. I think the first thing that you need to note here is that when you're discussing economics and how judges decipher your like calls or how judges decipher calls in terms of economics is showing that who is doing the best amount of good in the least amount of cost, which could simply indicate that if you're trying to like go ahead and move the needle in terms of some amount of like change, who is amounting to the best change in least cost, but also who is amounting to better quality of change. Now, the cost part is economics, the quality part is, of course, the substantial production of how those things operate. So, when you're debating upon these particular ideals and you're debating upon how these things operate, it becomes like a considerable factor in terms of understanding what supply and demand means, to understand what kind of like prioritizations or goals of prioritizations occur in terms of the sphere of economics. So once you've understood how this particular market phenomena works, it is easier to like understand what kind of external factors or externalities or shortages or surpluses or equilibriums could mean in terms of spaces. Now, let's look at another example just to clear this out. So we all faced the COVID-19 pandemic. When we were facing the pandemic initially, there was like a lot of shortage of say vaccinations. So if the market was to operate the way that it did, and we saw that the demand for the vaccines were high but the supply of the vaccines were low, which meant that the cost or the profit that they could gain per vaccine is that they could charge substantially more because this demand for the product was more. And that is what some companies could also be seen doing, right? They charge quite a bit of money marked up until and unless there were government subsidies or government caps. Now, this is what the behavior of the company or the behavior of that particular market is. Now, this is important again because then you understand that what is happening and what needs to change and what kind of like changes are required to be making this market sustainable. So, there's a simple idea behind this. So, if you're debating that prices of all COVID vaccines should be capped at a certain amount in my country, it could simply mean that then where is the problem? The problem is that there is a huge amount of demand and low amount of supply. The problem is that to maintain like resource proficiencies and to maintain profit, private market players who are producing these vaccines would often want to charge a markup because there is a high amount of demand and a low amount of supply, and they cannot match the demand of the market. So now that we understood that where this problem occurs, it is better and easier for us to know where we are arguing for in terms of this motion or against in terms of this motion. So what are the changes that government or opposition sides can bring around from this particular perspective of understanding how the market is operating? These four market behaviors therefore become very considerable, right? We have understood what equilibrium is, where if you're stabilizing or you want to stabilize prices, you are going to meet the demand by producing, or the supply and the demand needs to meet like at a point where they're both equivalent. For surplus, an excessive supply of certain things can eventually lead to a dropping of prices. Also, this can also mean that economic operations in a country are faltering if there is excessive surplus of certain aspects of things which are fundamental to the economy. An example here could be that if your country is, say, a resource producing country, if you are mining too much, the price of that goods falters. This could also be a good example that if you're talking about OPEC countries or countries which are oil producing and exporting countries, um, if you're producing more oil, but the supply of the oil remains the same, the cost of the oil gets lower. But if you're capping the production of oil, that this is the amount of oil I can supply to the market, but the demand of the market for that oil increases from time to time, you would automatically see that the price of that oil also increases from period to period. So that is how you can understand how different market pressures work and how market situations work, which can help you like derive argumentation or what to do on terms of those behaviors of the market. Now there are two other things about shortages and shifts. Sometimes high demands would incur low supply, which means it would automatically raise prices, as we discussed with the oil example and the vaccine example. Now, the last one is also equally as important, which is like shifts. So, external factors can also change supply or demand, which is affecting prices. Now, this can be simple. Let's take an example of a motion which is talking about supplying commodities to, say, rural regions, right? Now, if there is a problem in supplying to the rural regions because the cost of moving my goods from, say, a city to, say, a countryside or, say, a rural region is higher, it automatically means that the cost of that becomes higher, and the cost becomes higher, which means that your demand is not efficiently met. So these are important like aspects that you can consider. There are externalities which would often occur in terms of market pressures and market barriers that are occurring for these issues, and I think that becomes like a very fundamental part of understanding how you can debate different aspects. So while I am telling you these four market behaviors and giving you examples, you need to understand that I can't like classify all kinds of examples here or all factors in terms of how these particular issues might operate or how these things can be occurring, right? So I think you need to be careful in understanding how these things would be probable in dealing with different aspects. Also, whoever is using the whiteboard feature to annotate, please do not. It's highly distracting. So now if you're like looking at different other perspectives, right, you have to also consider what kind of like challenges and stuff occur in terms of beyond these market behaviors, which we'll discuss. Let me just like clear out the screen. Give me a second to figure out how to do that. Right, sorry about that, somebody is messing around within the participants. Right. Okay. So let's move on. Let's discuss some other economic principles as well, which are equally as important. So the first thing that comes around is the opportunity cost beyond market supply and demand. So, an opportunity cost is essentially the value of the next best alternative that you can give when you have to make a choice. So, every decision obviously has a cost principle associated with it, right? So, what could it be? Like, there is an alternative. So, suppose let's take an example of this workshop. The opportunity cost it would be that if you're being in this workshop, you can maybe not be napping, or maybe you're not like taking part in other exercises or activities, or maybe you're taking time away from your studies and so on. So the opportunity cost simply means that if you're taking part in this opportunity, what is the next thing that is going to be an option for you which you're missing out on to take part in this opportunity, which is what the opportunity cost is. Now again, relevance to debating. Suppose there are two things which we are doing in a prefers motion. This house prefers provision of social benefits to low income groups only over middle income groups, or to everybody in the society. So the opportunity cost would mean that if you're providing benefits to only the low income people, there are other people who would still want that, who would need that social safety net, who will not get that social safety net, and that is the opportunity cost which is there for application of like one preference over the other in that motion. So an opportunity cost in a debating sense can simply mean that what kind of losses are you willing to incur in terms of the things that you're prioritizing to do, or in terms of the things that you're choosing to do. What this essentially ends up doing for you is that you need to understand that when you're debating something, you cannot like bake the cake, eat the cake, and then also like distribute the cake at the same time, right? So there's going to be some things that you're going to go ahead and give away to your other side in terms of concessions. Now you, in terms of debating, have to show why those concessions are something which are not going to be as bad to make, or why prioritizing the thing that you are while making those concessions is equally as important, or equally like considerably necessary for making any necessary like ambits of change in terms of how that policy or how that social cause is going to go ahead and change those works and those like requirements. So you have to be careful in understanding what essentially are the burdens of the motion, what essentially does your prioritization of something means for you in terms of losing out on something else, and how in general terms that you can operate on say different paradigms and different like necessities within those particular practices. Now the next thing that we'll possibly be discussing, and I'm sorry I'm going a bit fast as well for this particular session, we don't have too much time and there's quite a lot of things to cover. Just bear with me. If there are any questions, as DSM was mentioning, please try to highlight them in your notes, and you can ask me at a time, at a later time. We will give you plenty of time to be asking questions as well. Right. So, what are incentives? So, incentives are aspects in which people often are responsive to. So, for instance, if somebody is poor, providing them meals or providing them like any sort of like social upliftment, or providing them things like jobs or food coupons or something like that, is the beneficial aspect that they probably try to like prioritize and probably be happy with. So incentives are things that are the basis of doing economic analysis generally. So incentives are essentially aspects where you fundamentally look at the category of people that you're trying to deal with, or the group of people that you're trying to deal with. You understand what kind of like things they prioritize. So, for instance, if you're talking about an environmental movement motion, your environmental movement would prioritize economic policies which are environmentally friendly, which would mean that, for example, if you are going to go ahead and promote clean air, clean energy, like solar panel subsidies and everything, those are things that the environmental movement would probably prioritize more than something else. So, you have to be careful in identifying what the incentives of these particular individuals within those motions are, or what the stakeholders of those motions have in terms of their incentives. So, in any policy debate or anything else, you can ask yourself this question: what new incentive does this policy create and for whom? So, you need to understand this from two levels. What are those benefits, and who does those benefits apply to? When you clear out those two aspects, It's much easier for you to a build questions or build answers to those questions, and also build like substantive material which you will be using for the debate itself. So let's discuss another example here. For instance, if you're talking about fining companies for pollution, which is your policy, the perverse incentive is for them to simply hide their pollution or move to a country with no regulations, making the problem worse. So there are multiple modalities of incentive that you need to deal with. What is A, the negative incentive, or what is B, the positive incentive, and how do you balance the two in terms of doing it? Now, let's return back towards our discussion a bit in terms of, say, supply demands and some examples for it, and how do those incentive schemes work. Let's take this example. If you ban product X, you do not eliminate the demand, you only destroy the legal supply. This creates a price vacuum that violent black markets will inevitably fill. Now, if you're reading this, the first idea that comes to your mind is that there is a motion which is talking about banning something. And if you're banning something, the question comes around that why would it not be sold in the market in the first place if people are still demanding it? Now, this is going back or tying back to that supply and demand like conversation we had early on, right? So, this example could be simple. I think if you would say this house would ban cigarettes, you are just moving the supply from a legal market to an illegal market. So it's fair arguments for opposition to make in terms of providing black market supplies and anything else. If you would have looked at some economic motions previously or some debates around economic motions previously, you would have seen that these are certain tactics or strategies that people do employ in terms of debating different aspects of these kind of motions, where you would say that if there is, say, a demand for that product, like for instance, people who are smoking would still want to smoke. People who are, say, consuming certain illicit substances would still want to consume those illicit substances. So even if they're banned, there are still certain methods in which those procurements are happening or in which those things are like occurring, right? So what this simply means is that there is of course going to be conversation points to be had as to how those demands are met, what is the requirements of those demands to be like removed, and how do you change those social policies to make those things more or less in terms of how those motions are framed. So, for instance, if you're talking about cigarettes, if the demand exists, you would probably talk about things like de addiction campaigns, uh, awareness campaigns where people are made aware about what problems tobacco has. School children can have like training programs and so on and so forth. So, you essentially discuss what kind of weaning off of those particular aspects can you make happen, which would inevitably like lower the demand, which would mean that the necessity for maintaining the supply or the illegal supply in this case would also be void. So yeah, I think those examples sort of like give us a good round off in terms of how to like build cases around supply and demand. But then how do you like build rebuttals around supply and demand? So I think the first thing about rebuttals in supply and demand is the idea about black markets and, say, illegal activities or some problem problematic causes which you can take part in. But the second ambit or the more technical ambit to look at in terms of the supply and demand rebuttal is elasticity. Now, elasticity is measuring how much demand changes when price changes, which means that what is the correlation between the supply of the commodity and the price of the commodity and the demand of the commodity. Now, inelastic demand means that when the price of a product goes up, people will still buy it because they have no choice. So, why are we discussing this? It is simple that there are certain commodities or certain things in how societies operate which are, regardless of cost, still going to be important and people will still purchase it. Even if, say, the cost of rice, wheat, or basic food items or, say, groceries increase, people still want to purchase because food is a basic necessity. If somebody is a diabetic and needs insulin every day, they would still be consuming insulin, they would still be requisite towards taking medication around those aspects. And I think that would mean that that particular demand would never change. So, even if you are increasing or decreasing the supply, that demand does not move proportional to that supply. So, elasticity is a good point of conversation when we are discussing different aspects of, say, how different market forces operate differently for different substances. Now, the same example can go into things, right, like cigarettes and everything. Even if you're increasing the cost of cigarettes, which many countries have done as a response to like trying to stop people from smoking as much and so on, it still doesn't help because at times this is something which falls completely flat because people would still want to purchase it. The same goes for things like petrol, the same goes for things like medicine and so on. Now, these things are important and these are considerably beneficial in terms of choosing what kind of alternatives or methods you're trying to use for making changes and making substantive inroads into different aspects. Now, let's look at the four other things that we'll probably be requiring in terms of an economic motion. What is a free market? What is market failure, externalities, and moral hazard? And all of these are foundational concepts which we will be using to build arguments. Now, free market and market failure. So, let's take an example and we can discuss it from there. The government should not intervene. The free market will solve the problem on its own. What this simply means is that a free market is a market where interference by government authorities or government figures or any other like policing mechanisms for the market is something which is not done or something which is not present. So, a free market can indicate a lot of different things. A free market can indicate, say, less regulation, less copious amounts of problems, and less amount of like issues in terms of moving different aspects of benefits or harms associated with it. Just a second, somebody's unmuted. Right, Emmanuel, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. Right. So, when we are discussing these particular ideas, what we need to consider is that in places like socialist states or places where you want to cap certain prices of commodities, like medicines, life saving medicines, generic drugs, and so on. If you want to cap those particular aspects, you need to always consider that that's not a free market anymore. So, what a free market is that it allows for everything to be done by market forces, which would mean that even if there's a natural disaster, even if there is like corporate problems for that company is producing that commodity, even if there is a shortage of supply, even if some company is becoming highly like um non-altruistic in terms of like hiking up prices or jacking up prices beyond reasonable limits, everything would automatically self-regulate is the idea that free markets operate within. But a market failure on the other end is when, if a free market is operating, it is always an argument that free markets are often inefficient or often produce bad outcomes. So what this simply means is that there are two aspects in which you need to look at different things, and some these are also relative to debate motions. I'll tie it back to you, tie it back for you in terms of those terms. So suppose we're debating upon foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is essentially something which is derivative from the idea of having free markets, where people from any scope or any potential background can come ahead and invest in different countries and different spaces. What this inherently means is that then you open up the market for having benefits associated with, say, liberalization of trade and different aspects. Now, liberalization of trade means that A, there is more amount of goods and services flowing into the community or into the economy, which could often mean that the quality is better and the supply is better, which is what the proponents for free markets usually argue. But there's also like a lot of other things which are considerably important to look into. One is that in the absence of foreign direct investment, there is no technological growth in that native country. In the absence of, say, the producer, if the producer suddenly is to leave the market tomorrow, you will automatically have a commodity that is completely, you're completely incapable to produce, but you also often might not have enough amount of like reserve supplies to meet that particular demand. Or in terms of, say, supply chain issues, like people from abroad, if they're shipping products to your country to sell them and it's something which is necessary in your country, there's often going to be problems in terms of how quickly the product can reach, which can often mean that there's also additional cost to the product and so on and so forth. So The reason why we are discussing all of this is that idea that motions are often structured around, say, free market principles, and also in terms of how market failures can make markets inefficient, and can also mean that there are certain things which you will be requiring to consider in terms of how you are keeping protection measures and you're keeping different aspects of things ready for not having these problems in the long run. So these would help you like assess different aspects of policies, but also give you ideas about how to like critique policies when you're thinking about how to rebut like motions in economics from the opposition bench. Now, what are the impacts of market failures, and what are essentially our externalities then? So an externality is a cost or benefit of an economic activity that is external to the transaction, that is, it affects a third party who had no say in the matter. Now, if, and this is a big if in certain motions, if somebody is like corrupt and if they are taking kickbacks for letting that product come into your country, that's an externality. If, say, you are the government of a country, you want to make the country better, but you don't have enough economic resources. So what you do is you go ahead to the IMF, you go ahead to the World Bank, and you go ahead and take a loan. The third party which is affected is the population of the country. Why? Because often associated with debt is the increase in taxation to recover the interest which is needed to repay the debt. So there are often like other people in relation to what you're arguing who are equally or more so affected. So what happens in debate sometimes is that people forget to look into like aspects of how market structures and market operations can often have some things which are not beneficial in the comparative as much as they think it is. Why? Because if you're trying to make a positive impact for, say, an X community, but then that X community within that positive impact has lost out or makes you lose out on, say, resources for Y community, and Y community has more amount of individuals than X, which means that you're running at a net negative impact in that debate. So whenever you're like arguing from an economic perspective, there's often chances that there are people on the contrary that are affected negatively by what you are choosing to prioritize in terms of your arguments around economics. So you have to be very careful about if those externalities are somebody who is like not going to make you lose the debate in their entirety because you're not considering their requirements in general. Some other examples from this could be that if you're saying that a government needs to provide more money towards or more money towards social welfare programs, the simple aspect is the cost is that more parks might need to be shut down, maintenance of other government facilities or other things might shut down because there's a finite amount of economic resources which is available to governments or to leaders to utilize in their particular countries or utilize in their particular like individual places. So what this essentially would mean is that the loss is relevant in terms of what types of benefit you're trying to like look into as well. So the benefit that you will argue probably is that people will have more amount of social capacity, but the cost is that people with, say, who are paying up taxation to fund the social welfare programs might get taxed more, so they might be disillusioned, they might be lead they might have unrest, they might have other problems. So I think that becomes an also important concern that you need to look into. The other aspects can also simply be that maybe there are other ways in which the country might falter. There is infrastructure costs which cannot be sustained if you're increasing other domains of financing, like for those social welfare programs. So there are always like multidimensional approaches that you can look into in terms of externalities and also in terms of how markets are operating. So you don't have to worry in terms of thinking about argumentation and how you can build argumentation. So the idea behind discussing externalities is that you have the key concern that whenever you are debating, that you whenever you're providing your arguments, try to also be careful that your claims or your warrants are not like conceding a lot of leeway or ground towards what the opposition can go ahead and like detract from your case. So there are two types of externalities, negative and positive, the harm or the benefit. An example for negative externality is if the factory is selling steel but imposes like pollution on the nearby community. That can be an example. So this can also be something which is relatable to you in terms of debating like um, economics under environment. Positive externality or the benefit, an example could be like for instance a beekeeper who is keeping bees and producing honey, but provides like a positive externality towards say a nearby apple orchard farm where indirectly that pollination from that bees is helping grow that economical um, industry as well, that it's helping you grow the orchard better. So those are important things that you can sort of like discuss. The last aspect is in terms of how the moral hazard also operates and how this is relatable in terms of debating terms. So a moral hazard is a situation where an actor is insulated from risk and therefore has an incentive to behave more recklessly. So now suppose you are the CEO of a company, or you're probably like, let's define this individual as somebody who is in the top wealth bracket. Now, in the top wealth bracket, if some supposedly you are like having no incentive to earn more money, you have enough money, but you still say want to preserve your money, you will probably have the incentive to maybe lay off staff from your workforce or do something which is problematic in terms of like maintaining who you are and therefore insulating yourself from risk. But that reckless action has probably caused a lot of like economic turmoil for other individuals or other people. Now, this could also apply to politicians. Like people say, as they call it, people sitting in high places throwing stones don't really know what's going on in the ground. And what that simply means is that politicians might try to make economic policy which is benefiting probably the country per se and like insulating themselves and the country. But there is also like a probability that these particular decisions can become reckless in terms of maybe minority communities or smaller communities who have adverse effects towards economic changes which are occurring in the world. For an example of this from India is this concept of demonetization, which happened where you suddenly make a currency like invalid overnight. So the government itself is insulated because the government can just exchange that tender for something else. There can be some other methods in terms of changing around money and so on. But the common man is proportionately affected and recklessly is put into a lot more risk. So those are ways in which you can probably utilize debate arguments as well in terms of like talking about what the moral hazard is and what kind of like prevention and policies probably look like. Now, as discussed the GDP, people argue from the perspective of the GDP a lot, but there is a lot of like intrinsic points. I will not be able to touch upon this a lot. So I'm also for the previous aspects also like supply and demand, market failures, market factors. I'm going and giving you an overview. I cannot go completely in depth and give you a complete like tear down as to what it is, which would take too much time to be honest. But again, GDP on the overview aspect is the total value of all goods and services which you're producing in the country. So, gross domestic product, as GDP stands for, is the average economic output of your country. However, there are certain caveats which are equally important to be considered when you're talking about GDP because GDP averages are not always like very reliable to consider. Firstly, the average can be misleading. Suppose there are 100 people. If 100 people earn 100 rupees, the GDP or maybe produce a total of like goods and services worth 100 rupees, the GDP or the average would be 100. But now if let's look at say the 10 people again, if 9 people produce something like 1 or 1 rupee worth of products or services, but the 10th person produces 900 and not exactly 999, sorry, 991, it would still mean that the average would come out to 100, but that one billionaire or the one person might have a much better like income or a much better like background of earning than, say, the other people who are part of societies. So this could apply to countries which are large concentration of billionaires or people who are wealthy. So a country with one billionaire or and nine homeless people would still like have a very good average GDP. So people usually use GDP to argue a lot in terms of positive impacts from that particular case. But the problem here is that that's not always true in terms of how those things are operative or in terms of how those countries are mixed and made up of. Simply because I think there is a lot of potential harms that come around from not like doing the economic analysis that is needed to prove something on the legwork of your argument, instead of just claiming that you have a good GDP, which means that everybody in the country is benefiting. And it's far more important to consider what kind of different social status or economic status do the people from that country operate within, and what kind of like necessary changes, benefits, or potential harms could be there, so that you can make a more comprehensive policy when you're modeling for policy debates. But also in terms of like general analysis of economic actors and economic incentives, you have a better case as well, because if you just argue that GDP is increasing so everybody is well and good, that's very like shallow legwork that your arguments are standing upon. So you have to be careful that you're doing it more justice by defining as to why most amount of people are going to get the most amount of good from that economic policy. So yeah. So the other thing is inflation. Inflation is the decrease in the purchasing power of money, seen as a general rise in prices. So this, and you could see examples around you as well. The cost of commodities, if it increase, and the amount of money you're spending to buy the same good or service increases, it means that you are increasing, or you're having inflation in your country. So an inflation essentially means that, for instance, if there is any goods or products that you like purchasing, or you have like in your market space and you want to purchase or want to do something with, and you are suddenly seeing that tomorrow the market is increasing the cost, it means that inflation has occurred, and the value of that money is lower. Inflation somehow is a lot more equivocal in different economies throughout the world. But in some places, the effects of inflation are pretty skewed. Um, in places like Myanmar or Bangladesh, suddenly the money of that country might suddenly lose a lot of value very soon, and that can be something which is very problematic to consider in general. So you have to be cognizant of what this considerable aspect of inflation means. Inflation can mean different things for different people. People with more economic capacity would face the aspects of inflation lesser. So, whenever you're debating around, say, different social groups or economic groups, if one economic group has more capacity, it means that the cost of living, or say the problems of inflation, is lower. And cost of living is also a significant aspect that is often used in debating, and it is something which is very significant. Cost of living is essentially the amount of money that you spend to procure the necessities or requirements for daily life. And if inflation is occurring in your country and there are two people here, one from a higher income bracket, one from a lower one, inflation adversely affects people with less amount of money to spare. So that is also something that is equally considerable when you are going ahead and looking at inflation for your economic arguments, for economic motions. Now, I'll quickly just go through a few more concepts before we open the floor for questions. And these are some things which are not really that well defined or well requisite in terms of economics, but it's general consideration for things like environment and so on. So, tragedy of the commons is essentially where a situation when multiple individuals are there and they act independently in their own self interest, but will ultimately deplete a shared limited resource. So if there are 100 people, all of them want to reach Canada, all 100 go through with their own planes. They all want to reach Canada, but they're all spending fuel instead of going with one platform and reaching Canada in and of itself. So what this means is that fuel might be a limited resource. You're depleting it 100 times faster by the action of these 100 individuals who are acting in their own self-interest. So This occurs more so proactively in, say, situations where there are limited resources like fuels, medicine, and so on. But in the long term, of course, even if you're acting in your self interest right now, in the long term, your own interests might be harmed because you will have to pay more for that commodity or that resource which is being lost because of utilizing it through your own self by only fulfilling your own like rational self interests in association with that. So, this can become relevant in terms of debates around how consumerism or capitalism is occurring, and that's a good example for it. An example again for this could be that if there is a shared pasture for sheep, if every farmer rationally adds one more sheep to maximize their own profit, the pasture would end up becoming overgrazed and also collapses, and therefore eventually everybody's interest is lost because their sheep themselves would start dying because of the lack of available resources. Now, let's look at what comparative advantages are. So, comparative advantages are some concepts which are important in considering, say, why one thing is better than the other. There are two key policies or frameworks that economics occur in terms of markets. One is Keynesian and one is um, Hayek's or Keynesian, the Austrian and Chicago school versus the Keene school. So I won't go much into depth with this particular thing. This is something that you will probably need to read after this workshop. In key nation politics, in key nation policies or philosophies, market failures are more common, and government spending is the engine of the economy in a crisis. So, this is essentially talking about crisis structures. So, in key nation policies, markets are expected to fail, and governments are the safeguards towards those markets. In Hayek or Friedman's like policy philosophy, a government intervention is the cause of the problem, not the solution. So one is prioritizing governmental intervention, and one is like deprioritizing governmental intervention. In Haitian policies or philosophies for economics, it is believed that free markets are the best in terms of self-correcting and self-rectifying problems in markets, and having too much like economic conflict by constantly changing economic policies by the center or a central body, or having like an economic body who is overseeing economic policy, is often the leading cause for creating like problems of slowing down the economy or other ways, like creating aspects of problems around how economies are operating. So that's how these two policies occur. But of course, there are different ways in which you approach this for debating. But since that's a long conversation, we'll probably not talk about it like a lot. So these are a couple of structures in which you are probably like going to go ahead and build economic disadvantage as a form of rebuttals or as a form of arguments geared towards the opposition. One, you will have to prove what the uniqueness of that economic disadvantage is, what the link towards your burden is, what the internal link towards different separate concepts within your argument is, and what the impact of your argument would eventually lead up to be. And rebutting economic arguments is also equally as simple. One, you have to attack the link or the causality of what those economic arguments are based upon. Second, you either attack the data or the premise of what those economic principles are going to go ahead and highlight as the basis of their intervention or the basis of their necessity. Thirdly, the turn is how you just offensively or uh, try to detract from what the core arguments or principles of that particular concept is, and then weigh the impacts, which is important in terms of practicalities of your argumentation from an economic standpoint. So I'll give you as an ending just a quick checklist about what you need to do in terms of economic argumentation. Firstly, you should always ask yourself the question, what is the incentive of doing something? Like, does your policy create a rational incentive or a perverse one? What kind of benefits are accruing? Secondly, you have to look at what is the opportunity cost. What am I giving up by doing this, or what is the necessity of doing this in contravention to others, and see if your opportunity cost is worth sacrificing over the choice that you're trying to make in terms of your economic policy. Thirdly, look for what is the probable causes of market failure or problems, and why is the justification there for intervention or the making of the policy or the changing of the status quo which you're trying to achieve by debating on that in terms of the prop world. what for the opposition is, then you have to ask for the opposition, what is the certain economic harm, like if there is any considerable problems of inflation, any moral hazards or something around the line. Fifthly, ask yourself what are the possible rebuttals which might come around from the other side. Is the demand inelastic? Is the data outdated? Or is there any other problem which is going to be there? And lastly, what is the weighing? Or is the harm reversible while what I am trying to propose irreversible? Is there much better anecdotes from what they are mentioning? And is it something that needs to be considered in terms of how operations are occurring within that particular paradigm? And yes, that's how you can build better, stronger economic arguments. Okay, thank you again for listening in. I'll quickly open the floor for questions if there are any. Otherwise, we can wrap up from there onwards. I'm monitoring the chat, but also if you want to unmute now, you can, and you can ask me questions from there onwards. No questions? Interesting. I probably either went too fast or explained everything in too much detail, probably. I do not know which one is the actual truth. But regardless, I'll wait for 30 seconds to a minute more to see if anything else pops up. I'll
Okay,
also,
Kaushik, are you there?
yes, I am here.
Okay, please, can you just take some time to give judges some guidelines on maybe how to judge economic motion? Thank you
Yeah,
so
yeah.
much.
Yep. Okay. I think I do classify a couple of these things when I was giving you like analysis on principles of what kind of different aspects of economics you can look at. But I think what judges need to do in terms of like judging economic motions is one, firstly, and very preemptively and importantly, check in your biases. Don't have any preconceived notions that these are better social policies or these are better economic policies just because you believe them to be true or not. Secondly, try to be reasonable and listen to both sides equivocally. You have to be careful in considering what each side is actually trying to propose. If there are any things which are called out by the opposition sides in terms of how different things are probably beneficial or harmful or bad or good, try to consider what kind of comparative worlds both are presenting. Look at what the picture, bigger picture from both the worlds are. See what kind of like changes or shifts in narratives or issues or aspects of those particular considerations are. What I mean by this is when you're judging economics motions, you just don't need to say to me that making money good. You need to prove to me that how you are actually achieving the making of that money or how you're achieving the benefit that you're trying to say that you will achieve for the economy. So if the debate is occurring without any like justification as to how you're going to go ahead and achieve those economic impacts which you're claiming, that automatically means that your argument is less persuasive. So judges would often have to be careful in terms of checking in that a you are careful in analyzing what has actually been said in the room, and that if that thing has been said, has it actually proven to be said in a manner where it would actually mean that there are tangible ways of achieving it. But b also sometimes judges also lose out on this in terms of note taking but also in terms of referencing what they need to do. They lose out on this idea that if you are probably having like some material from the other side which is directly contravening or either say retracting from or detracting from the benefits that the other side is stating, sometimes it's not considered as fruitfully or as beneficially. So yes, you have to be very careful in being fair as a judge towards both sides and considering everything equivocally. But also in terms of how I've mentioned to you, you have to be careful in terms of how you're going to go ahead and look at different economic operations or how those economic operations are suggested by the teams and how those things are actually impacted and improved. And yeah, more or less after that you are set in terms of the in terms of analysis, because you would then only need to like consider what kind of what degree of impact those teams have, who is actually going ahead and fulfilling that particular degree of impact. And lastly, just look at how the motion is structured and what the motion essentially is dealing with and what the intent of the motion is, in the sense that you classify those burdens properly in terms of how they are, and if the teams are then debating on the right and analysis and aspects of what that motion actually needs them to do. Because I've also seen that sometimes teams falter a lot when they don't like do it properly in that sense. But yeah, hope that answers that question. If there is anything else, I'll wait a bit longer and I'll see if there's anything else that needs to be responded to. I'm also dropping my number on the chat, and you can find me on Facebook as well in case you have queries beyond this session and want to come out and reach out to me later regarding any questions that you have.
All right, thank you so much, Dash. Truly appreciate you for such a wonderful session. I know you have a lot more in stock to say, but yeah, cares of time and also other classes that we have planned. Thank you so much, Stu. I trust you have much more time tomorrow to discuss the next workshop. So yeah, guys, Das is going to be showing up again tomorrow, same time. But this time around, it's going to be discussing law or criminal justice system entirely. So if you're a debater or a judge, you've been struggling with understanding how the criminal justice system works, or how do you argue legal motion, or anything that has to do with the state, law, and the people, Dash has got a lot of things in stock on that specific thing. So you don't want to miss it. Same time tomorrow. And after that, tomorrow, we are going to be receiving another workshop from a CAP member of Ignite 3, and that's Rahim. Rahim is going to be discussing another important content with us tomorrow. So please, guys, we have a lot of stock in preparation and also in plan for you, just to ensure that not only do you get better with your performance at the tournament, but the tournament is also significantly able to add to your knowledge bank through the workshops. So yeah, thank you so much. For the judges who stay through, I want you to know that your data have been recorded accordingly, and same will be patched through to the CAP members. And yeah, your test definitely drops tomorrow. So you're going to be having agitators test drop tomorrow for sure. Public speakers training comes up in the next couple of minutes. So thank you so much, everyone. Dash, thank you also for this amazing workshop. We truly, truly appreciate you. You may please help me to end the record, and then maybe end the meeting. Also, thank you so much.
Definitely. Again, thanks DSM for having me. Thank you everybody for showing up today. It was fun having all of you here and listening to me harp a lot about economics. But yeah, thank you. See you all tomorrow. Bye bye.